Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion. Actually, our wrapping up of our study of the Renaissance, right? We are about to wrap up our content-based study of the Renaissance in general before we move into our presentations that will start on Wednesday. And then also we're about to move into a completely new topic, right? So in this flip, we're about to be discussing some really, really big stuff that you're also talking about in your religion class, which is really, really exciting whenever all of our stuff starts crossing over like that, right? Cross-curricular stuff is always really important because it's not only going to help you in there, but it's also going to help you in my class as well, right? So going into it though, I'm going to go ahead and clip in about 5 minutes of this old flip real quick, just so we can talk about the printing revolution stuff and another guy by the name of Machiavelli, all right, that you'll see here in about 2 seconds. But go ahead, watch that, and I'll be right back. I'm going to do it though multiple different times. I'm going to do it hundreds of times so I can create a cheaper and more accessible book, right? A better text, right? But it's going to be much cheaper because it's not handwritten anymore. It's not hand decorated anymore. This is going to cause literacy rates to explode. The printing press is very important, and it's going to be important to the progression of European history for the next several hundred years, right? So looking at this thing as well, Gutenberg's press, though, is it the first one? No. It's important to actually discuss that really quickly, right? They're Asian kingdoms, and they're in the Manchu marketplace period, actually created printing presses over 100 years before Gutenberg ever created his. The only major difference between them was the fact that Gutenberg's was made out of metal, right? And the Asiatic ones were made out of wood. The types for the wooden ones would actually degrade a little bit faster. They soak ink up a lot and stuff like that. Whereas Gutenberg's printing press was made out of metal and was a little bit more sturdy and stuff like that, right? So what you're going to understand, though, is not only is Gutenberg's press going to be very important, but now print shops are going to be able to show up all over northern Italy, up in the Holy Roman Empire, and in these centers of like economic activity. And big thing as well, jot this down, print shops eventually become centers of propaganda, right? Which is a big thing as well when we get into the Reformation, okay? Now the thing, so we got one more big one that we got to talk about, and we got to go over him, and we got to make sure you know him, and you got to get after it, and his name is none other than Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli is probably the most important out of all these writers outside of Dante, right? I would say Dante and him like rival each other as the same. Dante's the most important writer pre-printing press. Machiavelli is the most important writer post-printing press because he wrote this right here, this famous book known as The Prince, right? The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli is probably the most important writing to come out of the Renaissance in its entire movement, okay? Niccolo Machiavelli, when he wrote The Prince, he tried to explore one philosophical construct. What is the best style of government, and how should a ruler rule over his people, right? And so the thing about it was he was inspired by this, okay? So just to give you some background on Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli is from Florence, right? He's from Florence, Italy. And so what other family is also from Florence, Italy? Oh, nothing other than the Medici, right? And apparently after the wake of this crazy monk named Girolamo Savonarola took over, and he kind of like had everybody in Florence like burn a bunch of stuff. Oh, fun fact, Elena Savage, your Birth of Venus was almost burned when this crazy monk took over Florence. Well, when this crazy monk took over Florence, he ran the Medici family out, and they were in exile for quite some time. Well, after that crazy monk ends up getting killed by the church and the Pope has him burned at the stake and stuff like that at the bonfire of the Vanities, or after the bonfire of the Vanities, this guy named Piero Soderini comes in and takes over in the wake of the absence of the Medici family. And Machiavelli is his assistant, right? And then here come the Medici back. They raised an army. They retake over Florence. Machiavelli ends up getting tortured by the Medici family, gets arrested, gets beaten, and then gets exiled out of Florence, right? And while he was exiled outside of Florence, he began to ask himself, after all that political turmoil, after a crazy monk shows up and burns everything, and then after this other guy shows up, and then after the Medici raise an army back and come back in, he wanted to ask himself, if a monarch is in charge and if rulers are in charge, is it better for that ruler to be feared or loved? What is better here? What is the better cocktail of all this stuff, right? Is it better for that ruler to be feared or loved, okay? Because he said, in the long run, let's go ahead and answer his question. What do you guys think? What do you think he said? I see a lot of nods. I see a lot of heads moving and stuff like that. Some of y'all might say loved because maybe you'll be less likely to act out against him if you love them. But some people say feared because you say you wouldn't want to be taken advantage of, right? Well, the thing about it is Machiavelli said that it's better for a ruler to be both if he can. But if he has to pick one, he needs to be feared, right? Because if you are feared, then you are going to be able to live effectively, rule effectively, and you will always know that the ends will justify the means.
What he basically advocated for was a cunning, ruthless ruler, right? Somebody that shows like the qualities of a wolf and a fox, right? Being intelligent and also very kind of malicious at times when they needed to be, right? And so the thing about it, though, is there's one very, very important little quote that goes along with this as well, okay? He said that, yes, a ruler must be feared or loved. Yes, whatever. You should be both, but it's better to be feared. But he also said you shouldn't be hated. Because if you are hated, the people will simply rise up against you and overthrow your government, right? And that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Terry from the past. That was in really dire need of a haircut in that old flip, right? But going into it, though, what we need to understand is, like I said, what we're about to move into, right? What we're about to change gears into here in a few minutes will actually come during the Renaissance itself, all right? So the Renaissance period and stuff like that is actually happening pretty much in tandem with this period that we're about to start talking about known as the Reformation, right? A lot of the stuff that is occurring at the exact same time, and some of the people and the characters that we're going to be talking about, even in your artwork presentations, are going to actually be able to kind of interact, know, and we're alive at the exact same time as many of our Reformation figures, right? So going into it, though, just so you know, before we can even start that Reformation, though, let's talk about the two different types of the Renaissance, right? So something that we're going to really, really understand more and more as we go on with our Renaissance artworks when we start presenting them on Wednesday. Remember, we don't have to present the artworks before we start talking about the Reformation because they're happening at the same time. Good job, everybody. All right. Now, the two different movements of the Renaissance that are going on in tandem with the Reformation, though, are, of course, known as the Italian Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. All right. Now, the Italian Renaissance, of course, is pretty obvious. It's happening in Italy, right? And there are major differences between the two art movements in general whenever you actually see them popping up, right? For example, in Italian artwork, you see extremely bright colors, whereas in Northern artwork, you see darker colors and typically much higher amounts of detail, right? Whenever you get into like actually studying these different artworks, we will talk about them a little bit more as we go forward. We will discuss what it means to be different between Italian work and Northern work and where they came chronologically next to one another, especially when we get into our presentations and stuff like that. But when we get into it, whenever you're looking at just an artwork in your face and you know one of them is from the Renaissance period, typically the brighter colored one is going to be from Italy, and the higher detail, maybe possibly darker hued one is usually going to be Northern. Now, going into our next one, something else you need to also understand is that Italian artwork typically has Greek, Roman, and mythological figures in it, right? So typically in Rome or in Italian artwork, you do see ones that end up having ancient Greek, ancient Roman, or Greco-Roman mythological figures in it, right? For example, you might actually see David, the statue of David by Michelangelo, is done in a mythical Romanesque style of a statue, right? Much like they would have actually done a Roman statue from the ancient time period. Or also you're going to see as well in the School of Athens, that actually included Greek and Roman philosophers that actually didn't exist around each other at the exact same time, right? So going into it though, as you also the birth of Venus focuses on Roman gods and goddesses, right? Now the Northern artworks though typically tended to include regular people. Now this wasn't completely different from the Italian artworks because Italian artworks were like sometimes portraits, and like you look at the Mona Lisa was a real woman and stuff like that. Her name was Elisa Ghirlandaio. And then but the regular people aspect of the Northern one is going to be important, not so much of just including wealthy people. For example, like this one right here, which is called the Arnolfini portrait, which I think Jalea Small has that one, I know, is one of them, and that's one of my favorite ones. But those are regular people and they were wealthy. There are also going to be regular people, including peasants, that are going to be included in Northern artwork as well. Now, another big thing about different art styles is there's a couple of art styles that will be almost exclusive to the Italian Renaissance, and a couple of art styles that will be almost exclusive to the Northern Renaissance. Now, in the Italian Renaissance, you're going to see the growth of frescoes, right? Which is, of course, the old school way of doing things that the Minoans actually originally invented, of using wet plaster and wet paint and painting the entire image before it dries, right? To make a permanent artwork piece. Whereas in the Northern artworks, you're going to see things like woodcuts be used, where you won't see those very much at all in Italian artworks. Not completely never ever, but not almost never at all. This, for example, right here is a woodcut. That right there is Night, Death, and the Devil. It's one of my favorite pieces by Albrecht Dürer. One of y'all is also going to be presenting on that one as well. How that thing was made was literally by having a block of wood and actually cutting etch marks into it and then putting it into a printing press, laying ink on top of it, and stamping it, much like you would actually repeatedly. I think some of y'all probably did that project in Miss Aconi's class at one point when you were taking her art class, right? Now, another thing we got to understand, though, is that Italian artwork has a lot of Christian themes, for example, like including this one right here, that has God, of course, like reaching out to the outstretched arm of Adam. And also, in Northern artwork, you're going to see Christian themes as well. But the thing you need to understand is that the Christian themes are going to be a lot more direct in Northern artwork and direct references to Christ and biblical stories as well. Whereas Italian art will have them interspersed with a lot of mythological figures and stuff like that, or parallels the actual Christian themes though too. But really quickly, if you're looking at it, they both tend to have them. Now what we're moving into though is something completely different that I'm going to need you to go ahead and break out the new color of pen or pencil. And whenever you're moving into your notes, I'm going to need you to go ahead and have a nice, big, new, pretty section, right? A completely new, different section that we are now moving into. We are talking about the Reformation, which is the word on the street, as I heard y'all start talking about this in your religion class as well. Now, the great thing about learning this in religion and then also learning this in my class is in religion, you will get the Catholic perspective, whereas in this class, we will talk much more about the political perspective, right? And the historical perspective of the Reformation, what caused it, what its major outcomes were, and stuff like that. But the problem is that a lot of y'all don't even really know what the Reformation is about. But let me tell you what the Reformation is about, all right? Basically, what's going to end up happening is people are going to use that humanist perspective that Renaissance thinkers actually use, that idea of applying real-world questions and questioning of things and the analysis of the things going on in our world, rather than focusing on the divine and theological text. People are going to be to use this idea of looking at things in the real world to question the central force in their lives, and not the faith of Christianity, not questioning the Bible, but rather questioning the church itself, right? Questioning the hierarchy, questioning the popes, questioning how it operates, questioning its corruption and stuff like that. And it's going to lead to the fracturing of the church in the 1500s, starting in 1517 and really not officially ending until 1648. So a 100-year-long period of reform and change in the Christian churches throughout Europe, right? Now, the thing you need to understand, though, before we can really talk about the Reformation, is it's formally known as the Protestant Reformation, right? The Protestant Reformation. Now, when we're looking at the Protestant Reformation, something you need to understand is it is a major movement that is going to split the church in Western Europe and lead to the creation of many new churches and denominations. Now, just so y'all understand something a little bit, that word right there, Protestant, is going to be very, very important as we go forward, because I was raised Protestant my entire life. I am not Catholic, right? I was not raised Catholic. I was never baptized Catholic, and I am not Catholic. But that doesn't mean somebody who's not Catholic is not Christian, because a lot of y'all have only ever been to Catholic churches in your entire life, or ever been surrounded by Catholic people, and you think that if you're not a Catholic, that means that, or you're not Christian. No, there's a lot of different types of Christianity, and all those things popped up in Western Europe during this movement, the Protestant Reformation. Because these Protestants, right, the people that were basically like my ancestral people, are going to choose to reform the church, hence why it's called the Protestant Reformation, right? Now, going into it, something you have to understand is that big difference right there, though, in the big word that I dropped in that definition. Because you know how Mr. Terry is. It's all about giving you a good definition and then also going into that definition and finding words you may not know and kind of quantifying them a little bit, right? So there's a big difference between a religion and a denomination, right? Denomination is very, very important when you're studying the Reformation before you ever even go into it, all right? I know this is a lot of words that end in T-I-O-N, but we got to understand this really, really quickly, okay? So when we're looking at the faith of Christianity, the religion of Christianity in general, we do know that we've already seen a split happen in it before the Reformation actually took hold in the 1500s. And that one's going to occur in the 1000s AD, right? In 1053, you're going to see this thing happen known as the Great Schism, which went down in the Byzantine Empire. Now, we know from the last time we studied the Byzantine Empire, when we were doing our Middle Ages stuff in general, if none of y'all remember this at all, that's a problem. You need to dive back into your notes, and that's why, Liliana Bracamonte, you never throw out your old notes, right? History builds upon itself. We got to be able to reference that old stuff all the time. Now, the Great Schism is going to be a thing that goes down in the Byzantine Empire when they couldn't agree on things like leaven versus unleavened bread. They couldn't agree on this idea of the filioque, or if they should say, and the Son, and the holy signs of the cross. They couldn't agree on that, if who should lead the church. Should it be a pope or a patriarch or a holy synod of some sort, right? And what's going to end up happening is in that Great Schism, you're going to see the Christian church split into two new branches, right? Called the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, right? And the Eastern Orthodox Church is going to take root in places like Greece and Eastern Europe, and it's going to continue to grow and expand. And to this day, they are actually still there, very much growing, very much expanding, right? Now, the Roman Catholic Church, on the other hand, is going to be headquartered in Italy, and it will become the main church, the main Christian church of Western Europe, right? Now, when I say Western Europe, I mean places like Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, the growing Holy Roman Empire, and also England at the time, right? Now, what's going to end up happening, though, in 1517 AD, in 1517, actually starting on Halloween Day in 1517, that church right there, the Roman Catholic one, is going to have some people split off of it again, right? And what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a big new chunk of branches inside of the Western European church. What will happen is Roman Catholics, some of them will stay Roman Catholic, and then the ones who break away from Roman Catholicism will be known as Protestants, right? And this Protestant Reformation began in 1517, right? Now, really, really quickly, when you're looking at the word Protestant, though, basically what it means is it refers to any type of Christian that's not Catholic, right? For example, when we look at all these different types of Christians that are not Catholic, as you can see, there are a lot more Protestants than there are Catholics, right? In the United States of America, Catholics are very much in the minority, right? There are not that many Catholics compared to Protestants because actually the founders of the United States of America were Protestant themselves. They were not actually Catholic. Now, there was a heavy amount of Catholic immigrants that moved into the Americas, starting as late as like the late 1600s, going into the 1700s. But just so you understand, there's a lot of Protestants out there, right? I know it doesn't seem that way when you live in a city like the greater New Orleans area because it's heavily Catholic, but outside of the greater New Orleans area, you might meet Lutherans or people who are Pentecostal or Methodist or Jehovah's Witness or Calvinists, which has other multiple types to it as well, Mormons, Episcopalians, Seventh-day Adventists, or this bad boy right here that I was raised as. I was raised as a Baptist, right? That is what we were referred to as, okay? And there's a lot of differences between these faiths and the Roman Catholic faith. For example, in a Baptist church that I was raised in, you have to choose to be baptized, right? You don't get baptized as a young age. Now, really quickly, that key difference right there is what leads to this breakup of churches and the creation of Protestant faiths. But when we look at all these different types of Protestants together, we refer to them as the multiple different types of denomination of Christianity, right? Denominations, when we refer to them in the church and the splitting of the church and the Roman Catholic Church in Western Europe during the 1500s, we are basically talking about the creation of a bunch of new churches and what is known as religious plurality inside of Western Europe during the 1500s, all right? So these new denominations will pop up and they will create themselves and they will solidify themselves in a lot of different countries throughout Europe during the 1500s, right? And the real reason what we need to dive into now, or not the real reason, but the big thing we need to dive into right now is why. Why did this happen, right? Why did this pop up? Why did all these new denominations show up out of nowhere? We have to really be diving into is what Catholicism was like in the 1400s. And what you must understand when you're studying Catholicism in the 1400s is the church was falling subject to a lot of corruption in the 1400s, okay? Now, before any of y'all ask, you're like, Mr. Terry, are you saying the things that are bad about the church? Don't even do that. I've talked to Mr. Mathern about this 100,000 times, and we have articulated this down to a perfect science of making sure that you understand that Mr. Terry is not coming at the Catholic Church right now, but he is saying historically there were some sketchy people in charge of it at one point or another, right? Well, I'm not talking about the faith. I'm talking about the people that ran it at the time. In the 1400s, we're falling subject to a lot of corruption as late as the late Middle Ages and going into the Renaissance, right? Now, again, what I need to say, though, okay, examples of this corruption before I go any further, all right, is there is a disclaimer. There is nothing wrong with the Catholic faith itself. We are pointing to people that were in charge of it and ran it and did certain things during the 1400s that are going to create a corrupt church that becomes very, very sketchy during that time period, right? Which leads to a lot of people being like, do I want to be involved with this anymore? And they break off and form their new churches, right? And all those people would be called Protestants. And since there's a bunch of different types of Protestants, we refer to all those people as denominations of Protestant, right? Now, the next thing we need to understand, though, is like to name a few examples of these church corruptions. Let's look at a couple of good examples, right? Now, one of the biggest ones that we've already talked about from the Middle Ages itself is a thing known as papal supremacy, right? And papal supremacy was that idea where popes were exacting a lot of political power over kings and rulers, basically trying to flex their biblical muscles, being like, oh, well, if you do not go along with the ideas that I want, if you do not allow me to pick my own bishops in your country, if you do not keep paying your tithes, I'll excommunicate you. Better yet, I'll interdict you and I'll take your entire country out of the game and I'll send all y'all to hell, right? Which is literally a papal suprematic stance, right? Of them trying to basically flex on people and be like, I have more political power than you, which is going to lead to a very, very hierarchical church and a very political church, which, as we all know, that's not the church's role and not what they're supposed to do, right? But you also have to understand that the reason why this papal supremacy was happening is because there were a lot of bad popes, right? Because bad popes were oftentimes operating a lot more like monarchs of state. They waged war, they taxed people, they were leading really lavish lives, they were super, super wealthy, and you're going to see a lot of weird stuff happen because of these bad popes, right? And it happened all the way back as long as the late Middle Ages. One of my favorite things to ever talk about is this thing called the Cadaver Synod that happened in 897 AD, where Pope Stephen VI, I believe, put this other guy named Pope Formosus on trial, right? Now, some of you are like, but Mr. Terry, I thought there's only supposed to be one pope. How does one pope put another one on trial? Well, Pope Formosus was dead. All right, so literally Pope Stephen had the dead body of the pope that came before him dug up out of his grave, put on trial. He then excommunicated him from beyond the afterlife, and then had his blessing fingers cut off, and he got him drugged through the streets of Rome, right? And he did this all as a political stunt because he didn't like the fact that a lot of Romans liked this other pope more than they liked him, right? Now, ironically enough, what ends up happening is a riot happens, and Stephen is then run out and stuff like that. But literally, it's absolutely wild that you dug up somebody's dead body and you put it on trial, man. That's kind of corrupt and weird, right? And then that happened in 897, so during the High Middle Ages. And also, fun fact, at this trial, some of you are probably like, well, how do you question a dead body? Well, fun fact, Stephen would actually accuse the dead body of Pope Formosus of a lot of stuff, and they actually paid a young deacon, who was basically like a boy, to stand behind like the dead body and go, I'm sorry for what I've done, and basically play like puppet with it the entire time, which is super weird. Now, going into the next one, we also have to understand this guy named Julius II, who was also known as the Warrior Pope, who was in power from 1503 to 1513. He is the same guy that is going to pay Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and he is also the same Pope that is going to die of syphilis, right? Now, which is a disease that you're not supposed to have if you're a Pope. Isn't that right? Y'all know who I'm talking about? No, now. Going into it, though, he invaded Italy at least 3 separate times. He bought his way into the papal reigns. And you have to understand, it's just a lot of very, very suspect stuff, right? And even Dante himself is going to make fun of the entire Pope and the papacy and what was going on at the time. Dante, in his late writing, or in the Divine Comedy, there's actually one circle of hell he goes into, which is like past the layers of wrath and past the wall of dis. And all these little feet that are sticking out of the ground right there, those are priests that have been accused of simony, right? And simony is the selling of church offices for financial gain. And so basically he said that they're all being stuck into flaming cauldrons and demons are poking their feet for all of eternity, right? Which is absolutely wild, Dante. That's a really, really aggressive picture, big guy. And then another big thing you have to understand is there's going to be acts of Inquisition, torture, execution, and the Spanish Inquisition is another great example of this. But we'll talk about all that stuff when I see y'all again soon, okay? We're going to cut it off right there, and we'll keep going with all this stuff about the Reformation and when it blows up, and we'll talk about the entrance of Martin Luther into the game when I see y'all in our next class. Have a good one.